There was one other man who would play perhaps the most pivotal role in the restoration of St. Joseph's. The 77-year-old pastor of the church, Father Edward Filipiak. It was Father Filipiak who had first pulled together this small posse of visionaries and implored them to take on the task of saving this historic church.
And I came down the first morning and met the priest, who was very old, snaggle-toothed. I mean, you know, certainly nothing great in appearance. Had a great smile. This is Father Filipiak. And I thought, my first reaction when I saw that number one, he was living in the worst poverty I'd seen. I had done the survey of LaSalle Park and had stepped on vagrants and everything else, but I had never seen anybody living in the conditions that he was living in. And the rectory had most of the plaster off the walls. The electrical system was a very spooky cord hanging from the ceiling that had probably hung there for 100 years with a light bulb on the end of it. He was so frail that he couldn't get in and out of the safe, so he had church records all over the floor where he could access them. He lived in one room on the best that could be said for it is high army furniture.
I don't know anybody else who would live in the conditions that that man. I'd visit with him. He had 2.5-inch roaches crawling up the wall, and it wasn't habitable for animals, much less a human, much less a priest.
And I thought, you know, what am I getting into? We walked through the door into the church, and the man totally changed. I mean, he just radiated, and he said, "Isn't it beautiful?" And I realized then that the reason he lived that way was that every penny that he had and every penny that came into this church, he put into keeping the church standing. He was bent and determined that this church would survive. And from that moment on, I was committed. I mean, there just, you know, there was no turning back. It had to be done.
At the time, Father Filipiak was one of the oldest priests in the Archdiocese. While his role at St. Joseph's was to pastor the small number of parishioners, he also became a watchdog of sorts, a gatekeeper who knew that if he ever moved out, there would be virtually no hope of saving the church.
We didn't try to talk him out of staying here because, I mean, that would be like trying to talk to Mount Rushmore to, you know, become a gravel pit. He was committed. He never wavered in, and he never allowed us to even do the slightest improvement in the house.
He totally refused to move. And he told me many times, I used to stop and visit with him, he said, "The day I move out, the next morning the headache bill will be in here." And he says, "I ain't moving." That's his words. "I ain't moving," he said.
What was wonderful about him was that he was in this, what I guess most priests would view as the parish from hell, and it didn't bother him at all.
Saving St. Joseph's and restoring it would be a nearly impossible task. It would take literally years of work by a group of volunteers trying desperately to salvage a hulk of a building no one seemed to have any use for. The first needs were obvious: a new roof and the money to put it on.
So I called up Bob Ortega on January 8th, and I said, "I got an idea, Bob." I says, "Father Filipiak can't raise money, but you and I aren't priests." I says, "Why don't we start a not-for-profit corporation, set up a fund in a bank where people send." The roof was leaking terribly. Oh, it was, you know, then nobody would fix it, because I think they quite frankly wanted the place to get so bad it had to be torn down. And they said, we'll raise money for a roof, and if we can't pull this thing off, the bank will hold the money, and if we can't pull it off, the people get their money back, so they have nothing to lose. And if we do put the roof on, everybody's gained.
Meantime, rumors continued to run rampant that the Archdiocese wanted to abandon the parish, sell the land, and build another church a few blocks east, closer to the new convention center. About the same time, it was discovered that originally the land here at 11th and Biddle had belonged to the Biddle family and had been donated to the Archdiocese specifically for the purpose of building St. Joseph's Church. The agreement with the Archdiocese stipulated that the land could never be sold for a non-religious purpose. Otherwise, the property would revert back to the Biddle estate. That meant the Archdiocese could not sell the land and reap any financial benefits. The Friends of St. Joseph now had some new life and new hope. They would eventually lease the church from the Archdiocese for 5 years at a cost of $1 a year. It was an effort to see if this small group of men could do the impossible: raise the money needed to restore a church nobody wanted. The initial efforts to raise the money were stymied. No one wanted to donate or invest any money in a depressed neighborhood for a church that had more pigeons than parishioners. Father Filipiak continued to stay in the old rectory and kept insisting that no money be spent on him.
He says, Gene, don't spend a penny on me. He says, put it in the church. He says, I'd die for this church. He refused to move. He said, I'd die for that church, and he did.
St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, the 8th chapter, the 28th verse, says that we know that God makes all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his decree. In perhaps the darkest hour in the history of St. Joseph's, God would make all things work together for those who were trying so valiantly to rebuild an historic church. An act of violence would rally an entire city around this seemingly hopeless cause to save St. Joseph's. During the evening of September 29, 1979, 3 teenage boys entered the rundown rectory, made their way upstairs to the second-floor room of Father Filipiak, and brutally murdered him.
In fact, he would stick up for anybody. That's why when he was murdered, it was just a waste of a life, because he would have gave those 3 boys that did it, he would have given them whatever he had. They didn't have to do it, because he used to sit out on the steps, and when kids would go by, he'd give them whatever he had in his pocket. That's just the type of person he was. And they caught the 3 fellas that murdered him. And one was killed in prison, one committed suicide in prison, and one still is in prison. I was floored. I mean, I really was. It just shocked me. In fact, that was one of the hardest funerals I ever played.
I was at home because they called as soon as they had found the body. But and it was a terrible shock. But what it did was it galvanized the community. I mean, I think without his death, we probably wouldn't have done it either.
Father, of course, would never believe what had happened after his death, but certainly it was his death that really began everything here. There were people prior to his death trying to do things, but they couldn't seem to get the money to do them. And so, you know, that death really, really inspired people, to say the least.